This episode is presented by our partners at DraftKings Sportsbook, America's top-rated sportsbook app. Download the DraftKings app now and use code Dan to get in on the action.
We will get in a moment to Billy Corbin getting his ass kicked on everything that was on the ballot in a way that really bummed me out, legitimately bummed me out for the future of South Florida. But at the moment, we want to welcome in a man, I believe I can say flatly, that Billy and I admire as much as anyone who does the kinds of things that we like to do, whether it be muckraking or rebellion or journalism or holding people accountable with truth. I believe I could say that Billy is trying to do the work of a legend, Carl Hiaasen. You learned as a young man, correct? You learned as I did, as a boy, what it was like, the power to see a columnist go after people who needed to be chased a little bit.
As your wife grew up listening to you on the radio, I grew up reading Carl Hiaasen.
An unfair shot by you. Unfair. He just wanted to get... I'm sitting here trying to get him to talk about how much he loves you, and instead he talks about the age disparity between me and my wife, Carl. That's what he does.
I've got one of those too, disparities. I would much rather talk about the work Billy is doing out there, chasing.
We didn't listen. I called a mutual friend of ours, Tim Chapman, to say what any insight you can give me in this conversation we're going to have with Carl today. And I've never had this happen before. He pled the fifth. He says anything I say could be incriminating, and on advice of counsel, I refuse to answer.
People listening right now don't know who Tim Chapman is. Tim Chapman is a legendary photographer, outdoorsman, and a man who doesn't often plead the fifth. So his stories must be very good. But let's get into Carl, because Miami's as screwed up as it ever was, and you really made your career took off, at least in part, correct? Because Miami was so goddamn strange.
That was the irony, is that the things that upset all of us as citizens, or enrage all of us, or sadden all of us as citizens, turned out to be the currency of our trades. Is that the more perverse it got, the more corrupt it got, and the more stuff there was to write about or report on was good for business. I mean, people wanted to read. People, all around the country, I think, became familiar with the bizarre happenings and the characters in South Florida. And we were conveyors of that information. So in one sense, we were benefiting from it because there was this appetite for it. On the other sense, as I said, as a citizen and a father and, now a grandfather, this stuff still breaks your heart.
Before Carl Hiaasen was a legendary best-selling author, he was a legendary columnist, and before that, he was a legendary reporter. I want to talk about some of the early work, but first I want to recommend to everyone, Carl has 2 volumes of his collected columns in Kick-Ass and Paradise Screwed, which are essential reading, not only for all Miamians, but since we have so many new Miamians, or anyone who's looking to kind of do what, Dan, you're trying to do with this podcast, is going to give people an insight into the DNA that has toxic DNA.
It is bizarro cartoon Miami as a history lesson. You will not believe how rich this terrain is. This man writing about this stuff, that the truth was stranger and funnier than what a comedic writer could conjure in fiction.
I did those anthologies, and actually there was a third one I did called Dance of the Reptiles, the last one, which was originally going to be called Festival of Horrors, but I felt it intruded on...
Why didn't you call it that? That's a great name. Why didn't
That'll be the fourth one.
Well, that was whenever Tallahassee, the legislature convened, I was always proud that I could get that phrase in the Miami Herald, but no one could really argue it because it is a festival of horrors up there. But one of the reasons I did the collections of the columns, and I don't get any money from those at all, they go to a scholarship foundation I have at the University of Florida. But the reason I did it was for people who didn't live in Florida and thought I was just a twisted, perverted, the stuff that in the novels, they would read the novels and say, well, none of this can be true. So part of my motive for doing the column anthologies was this documentation that I'm not making this up. Look at this. This is worse than what was in the book.
One of my favorite early stories of yours, such that I made a documentary in part about it, which is a job you were on with Tim Chapman in Everglades City. the famous Operation Everglades 1 and 2. I think you were there pre-dawn, weren't you? You got a tip-off? How did that happen?
The essential plan for the DEA was basically arrest the entire male adult population of Everglades City at the time for smuggling weed. They had a fishing boat population, they would go out and just a mothership operation, It was part of the culture. Everglades City is still a pretty interesting place in that way. But I got a tip and Tim got a tip. I believe Jeff Lean, who's now the head of the investigations team of the Washington Post, was there too, or was involved in it. He was in the Naples bureau of the Herald, and he came down. But anyway, this is a classic Tim Chapman story. So we have to go over. There's one motel, and we can't go on the island, Everglades City and Chokoloskee, because the DEA is going to seal off the bridges, but we can come in right after that. So we're waiting for the word. And I'm at this motel, but Tim is supposed to be there hours ago. And he's the main photographer, and he's the combat. He's the guy that wades in with the cameras. It doesn't matter how many guns are there. He's just one of the. So I'm waiting. I don't want to go in by myself. I don't even know. And the guy is going to let us in. So about 1 a.m, I hear this screech of tires in the parking lot of the motel. It's Tim. His tires are smoking, and he pulls in. And this is a true story. I said, where the hell have you been, man? We're trying to get mobilized. He goes, I had to go see my dental hygienist. I said, your dental hygienist? He goes, well, and he just winks. He goes, actually, it was 2 hygienists. And
Everglades City is an island town, kind of, we'll say halfway between Miami-Dade County and Naples. It's literally in the middle of the Everglades. There's a sign to this day that says the last frontier. In fact, even off the Tamiami Trail in the middle of the Everglades, you still have to go another mile or 2 down the road to even find these kind of twin island communities of Everglades City and Chokoloskee. Population 400 to 500 then, population 400 to 500 probably now.
From another time, correct?
From another time, yeah. It's a fishing village. Their whole business, they're just fishermen, and now to this day, stone crab. That's their major lifeblood. Is they supply, I think, all their jumbos and larges go right to Joe's on a refrigerated truck. You can also get all you can eat stone crabs right along the river to this day in Everglades City. It's a fascinating place. One of the guys we interviewed said, though, because there's really only 2 last names in the entire town, he said he needed to get a driver's license to lose his virginity. He needed to find someone he wasn't related to, and so it's a really colorful place. But what happened was when the state park came in, the Everglades, it kind of cut down on the fishing licenses and where they were able to fish and make a living. And so in an act of desperation and perhaps also rebellion, they call it the last frontier, the vast majority of the town got into pothauling in the late 70s, early 80s. And it's a very unique topography there, what they call the 10,000 Islands, which is this maze of mangroves that at any time of high tide or low tide completely transforms. It's an ever-changing labyrinth that really only if you grew up there on a boat there would you be familiar with. And so they were really able to outsmart anybody who was looking to enforce anything down there until the DEA came to town, literally shut down the one entrance in and out of town to which, Carl and Tim had been tipped off to and arrested really, over the course of Operation Everglades 1 and 2 in 83 and 84, arrested the vast majority of the male population of the entire community.
How is it possible that the same shit that was happening when you were writing about it outraged, whether it was sugar fields in Belglade, that the corruption is just as rampant as it ever was, that for all the work that we tried to do at the Miami Herald and all the work that you and Billy continue to try to do, that you're losing and will continue to lose until South Florida is underwater?
Well, South Florida is sinking, but I don't even think sinking it will stop the corruption. I think I think the corruption is back when I started at the Herald in 76. So back then, they weren't very clever about the corruption. It was literally like cash in paper bags. I mean, they didn't have offshore companies yet. They didn't have crypto. They didn't have any ways to move money around that you could. I mean, these idiots would literally go from the county commission meeting to sit in a car with somebody and get a bag full of cash and have a beer. And so the FBI can sit there and take pictures of it. Now I think enough of them have gone to jail that the newer generations are a little more sophisticated, but they're not any less greedy. They've just found other ways to steal. And there's a basic built-in corruption because of the lobbyists. It legitimizes what amounts to a bribe. A lobbyist comes to you and says, you give me your vote, my people want you to vote this way on a zoning issue, and then I'm going to bundle your next election. I'm going to bundle 50 contributions, maximum contributions. I'm going to collect. And it isn't necessarily, here's a new Cadillac. It's, I'll get you reelected because all these people, I can bundle the contributions to get you reelected. That to me is even a more insidious form because it's legal.
We had two mayors in a row in the city of Miami who were known in chronological order as Mayor Loco and then Crazy Joe.
Yeah, I used to write both.
Listen, Carl, if I told you 30 years ago Carollo would still be in charge, there's no way you would have believed it. You wouldn't have believed it.
No, I wouldn't. I would never have believed it. You're right. I would never have believed it. And it says something certainly about him, but also about the short-term memories that the public has or chooses to have, unwillingness to educate themselves as to who they're voting for. That's the astonishing thing. I mean, the idea he has balls that kept him in the game all this time, but how stupid can voters be? And this is a question, of course, it's especially come to the fore in the last few years in this country. How dumb can you really be? And the truth is, it's bottomless stupidity. You can't even estimate how stupid people are.
The current mayor of Miami, of course, is a second-generation mayor, as is the current mayor of Miami Beach. But Francis Suarez's father, Xavier, you dubbed the Midnight Rambler in your columns. Do you remember that story?
Oh, there was a couple of them. One of them, he was knocking on the door of a constituent late at night in Little Havana. He showed up. And he was a good dresser. She's busy on the other side. She's scared shitless, and she's busy on the other side of the door trying to load a revolver to shoot through the door. And finally, his people yell, no, it's the mayor, it's the mayor. It's like she's in her dressing gown. And then the other rambling story was early one morning, he heard there was going to be some big negative story about him in the Herald, and he showed up in the Herald lobby where we had newspaper racks. That was the first rack. They came off the presses, Dan, you remember, and they just put the rack, so there was a rack there, and he showed up in his bathrobe. A kind of a haunting image if you really think about it. Then I started affectionately calling him Mayor Loco. For some reason, he took offense.
And in fact, he called and left a recorded message at the Miami Herald saying that the city subsidizes this newspaper by virtue of having to take out ads to announce certain city meetings and events, and that if the coverage in the paper did not improve, the coverage of him and the city did not get better, that he was threatening to pull those ads and pull that money away from the paper, and recorded that. Wound up on 60 Minutes, no less. And one of my favorite details from that particular story that was included in the Steve Kroft report, Welcome to Miami, back in 97, 98, was Carl recalled that the woman who was loading her .38 on the other side of the door, scared in the middle of the night that this man was banging on her door because she wrote an unflattering letter to the editor at the Herald, they were hollow point bullets that she was loading.
That's right. That's Miami. That's an educated constituency right there. I'll tell you a funny another Joe Carollo story. When I started the column in the early mid 80s, and I wrote some columns about Joe, and he went to the city commission. He had them do a declaration or whatever it's called, just whatever the bullshit thing, declaration or something that they all signed, condemning me on general principles. I mean, named me as and I remember getting a copy of that. I was just starting out writing the novels.
What a great honor.
I started, and I sent it to my editor. I said, is it too late to get this on the book jacket? It was the best blurb for selling books.
Unbelievable. What a great honor. You got a declaration of what?
I have that. I have that in a file somewhere. It was one of my proudest moments, of my career.
That election, the 1997 election for the Miami mayor, I believe was a prelude to what we would see in the 2000 presidential election in South Florida. That Miami, we just ain't too good at their elections, and that 97 election, which formed the basis in no small part of the 60 Minutes story we were just talking about, was, I don't even know how to describe what happened there. It was Xavier Suarez versus Joe Carollo, who had won in a special election and only served, I think, about a year or two at that point. The previous mayor had died. Dick Clark's brother, as I recall, had died, and Joe Carollo won in the special election and now needed to run in a proper regular election. He was running against Xavier Suarez, who had previously, of course, been the mayor of the city of Miami already at that point. And I think the margin was 155 votes or something like that. And that was just the beginning of the story. Xavier Suarez won, apparently. But then, Carl, what happened in that election?
Was that the first time that Manuel Yip voted?
Well, that was the 6th time that he voted, but the first time we discovered that he voted. Yes, super voter Manny Yip.
Was it 6th time before or after he died?
After he died. That's super voter Manny Yip. Yes.
Yeah, Manny Yip. Yeah, that Also, if you're casting like a sitcom or a movie about this, you don't even have to make up the name. I mean, you don't even need a writer's room to come up with the names of the characters. Manny Yip. Okay, of course, he's a dead guy who's voting. Well, who else would he?
And what winds up happening is the judge basically doesn't order a new election, but just simply basically says there was so much fraud that favored Xavier Suarez. There was a 92-year-old woman found with a stack of 100 absentee ballots and a bunch of voter IDs. And the judge just said, you know what? I'm just going to give the election to Joe Carollo.
Carl's writing is part of what made you care about some of this stuff, right? The imprinting was such that Billy Corbin, high schooler who's going to school with a briefcase in high school because he wants to be a filmmaker, he wants to be a teller of truth. Like, Carl is shaping your worldview, is he not?
And still, I mean, I'll never forget. I don't know how many columns, Carl, there was another Miami City commissioner by the name of Miller Dawkins who was caught up in a corruption situation where there were city commissioners, there was the CFO of the city, there was the city manager, all of whom were either under indictment or pled guilty or under arrest for various corruption-related schemes. But Miller Dawkins, who was involved in a lot of chicanery, he at some point, and Carl wrote this in multiple columns, and I never forgot this, and it led me to some repetition in my work, because it's important to imprint and brand certain information that people need to know by way of exposition. When you're introducing someone to a character, what do you need to know about that person? And Carl very often wrote, Commissioner Miller Dawkins, and it didn't matter what the subject of
could have been anything.
He could have been talking about any issue that or any f***ery.
It was like his last name.
Right,
it was Dawkins was the beginning of his last name. This was the rest of it.
Miller Dawkins, comma, who once threatened to burn down an AIDS clinic, comma, and then would continue to write, because that's really all you needed to know about. Like, okay, now I know who we're dealing with here. That was the exposition. And I never forgot that. And because it was like, because who the hell would do that? And then whatever Carl was going to tell us that he did now would be perfectly plausible in the world of this is the background of this guy. Miller Dawkins. Tell me about Miller Dawkins. He's gone, but he's fortunately not the mayor right now. But
no, he's not. It just, when you look at the cast of characters, but then like Dan said, I don't know, your feeble hope as a journalist, just by writing about it, not just exposing it, because we had reporters in the street that were digging the stuff up. It was like shooting fish in a barrel for me, but at the same time, you think you're hoping that at least somebody's paying attention, because this is your town, your community, your kids go to school here. It's your police force. It's your fire department, which, and they had that scandal in the fire department where they were targeting a black firefighter and doing the scrotum on the head thing. And Joan Fleischman had broken the story because there was going to be a lawsuit about the guy. Every time he fell asleep in the firehouse, Thank you
for the clarification. You can't just drop scrotum on the head thing and just leave it out there without elaborating.
But Dan, here's the best part: is we were trying in the newsroom to figure out how to wait, and that's what the firefighters referred it to. If you talk to them, oh, you mean the scrotum on the head? It was like a thing, and we didn't know that. So Joan wrote it with a very straight as you could be with that. But the poor dude, I mean, every time he'd fall asleep, somebody in the firehouse would do. So then, I mean, that's the sort of thing you write the column. You thought, I'd have to be such a sick son of a bitch to even make up this. And I didn't even put that in a novel. I never even went near that for fiction.
You made up some sick shit. Like you made up, you went into some pretty depraved spaces to make up shit. And even you wouldn't you wouldn't even touch a Tuesday in the Miami Fire Department surrounded by corruption.
There's certain things you can't improve on in fiction. In other words, what happens in South Florida, some of it, you can't even, for satirical purposes, you can't make it any funnier or any sicker. So you just have to hold back and stay away.
Stu Gatz here for our friends over at Ladder Insurance. We appreciate their support. Listen, with the rising cost of living, rising student debt, buying a house, the last thing you want to do is leave your kids or partner with a huge financial burden. On that note, it makes sense why people get life insurance, especially term coverage, which is surprisingly affordable. Why not pay a bit each month to protect the ones you love? If you're asking yourself this question, choose Ladder. Ladder is 100% digital, no doctors, no needles, no paperwork. When you apply for $3 million in coverage or less, you just need a few minutes and a phone or laptop to apply. Ladder's smart algorithms work in real time, so you'll find out instantly if you are approved. Finally, since life insurance costs more as you age, now's the time to cross it off your list. Do it today. Go to ladderlife.com/Dan today to see if you're instantly approved. That's LADDER life.com/Dan, ladderlife.com/Dan.
We continue here with legendary columnist and novelist Carl Hiaasen, whose new book, Squeeze Me, is something you can get now.
Not to get too dark, I was in Los Angeles finishing our new documentary series for Netflix, Cocaine Cowboys, The Kings of Miami, when the tragedy at the Champlain Tower South occurred. And people started calling me for a reaction. And I went to an old line of mine, which is that Florida rarely shocks me, but regularly disappoints me. And USA Today has done some outstanding investigative reporting on this, on some of the drug money laundering, some of the corners that were cut by developers. And, at the time, as I say, those buildings on the barrier island of Miami Beach, they only have water coming at them from the front, the back, below, and above, for decades on end. We reclaim the wetlands and the wetlands will eventually reclaim us. But the point is that this is not the only building where there was money laundering, where corners were cut, where you've seen through the decades unscrupulous developers come in. I mean, Paradise Screwed is the name of one of your collections. So what was your reaction to that tragedy? I went on a podcast and I said, this is going to happen again. If we continue to behave the way we've been behaving, just unfettered development with no vision and no plan, with finite resources on a peninsula, growth as our only economic engine is unsustainable.
It is. And in this case, it's a miracle that it hadn't happened before this. In those days, some of those big high rises that went up on the beach side, I talked to somebody who worked on one of those crews that you and I both know, and they were making some of the concrete with salt water. You aren't supposed to mix it with salt, but so it already had the salt component in the composite, and then you put rebar in there, and it's going to decay at a much, much faster rate. But the point is, it is an absolute miracle it hasn't happened. I mean, for me, Hurricane Andrew, which if you looked at an aerial map, you had neighborhoods that were completely intact, and across the street, every shitty house that was built for nothing had fallen apart. That wasn't a coincidence. And I don't know if you remember, and I did a column about these guys too, but remember the drive-by roof inspections?
No, I don't.
They used to do drive-by. These developments are going up so freaking fast. The roof inspectors, sometimes they didn't even have a ladder on the truck. They just drove down the street and said, yeah, that one's good, that one's good, that one's good. And guess what houses blew down? If you have a roof inspector who isn't carrying a ladder, you just basically have a guy with a cup of coffee driving around. But that's how that shit went down. They did see some change after. I mean, the building codes did get tougher, right? But what do you do retroactively going back to the 70s when they were throwing these things up left and right, the high rises? I mean, you hate to say it's going to happen again. I don't see how it's not going to happen.
Is it worse now, though? Is all of it worse now? I don't know what scares you most on behalf of someone who cares about South Florida the way that we care about South Florida for the future of South Florida. But is it worse now, or is it just same as it ever was? It was pretty damn bad when you were writing about what Big Sugar was doing.
I think there is a heightened political awareness on the part of the wrongdoers. I think they're slicker. I think they get better lobbyists. I think they don't move money as clumsily. I don't think they're dragging suitcases of cash into the banks anymore. They figured out other ways to do it. But I think exponentially, because the growth in the population, Dan, look at how much the municipalities have grown. I don't know how many separate municipalities are in Miami-Dade right now.
34
but
now.
Each one of those, and I tell people, I said, the tragedy of what's happened to newspapers isn't that the Miami Herald isn't going to have a bureau in Afghanistan telling you can find out what's going on in Afghanistan from the Journal, the Post, the Time. What's tragedy is you're not going to be able to find out what's going on in Medley. And every single one of these little governments, the opportunity for these trolls to steal is still out there. One development, one housing development, you get to a small community and they spread the money around and they got the votes. And that's what's going on. So I think it's worse now just because there's more of them. To be honest, there's more people and there's more opportunity.
Yeah, the spirit of the municipalities, Dan, you and I have discussed this before, was to create more localized, more accountable, more transparent government. And instead, what it's become is 34 new opportunities to steal from us. 34 pots of gold, 34 fiefdoms for political crime families and dynasties and lobbyists to get a foothold and basically run the entire town into the ground, using the residents not as constituents but actually as victims, of racketeering organizations. You can look at entire cities, whether it's Miami or Opa-locka or Florida City or Homestead or Hialeah or Miami Gardens, and some of them are nothing. I mean, the FBI raided Opa-locka City Hall, for crying out loud, taking out boxes and boxes of files.
They're just continuing criminal enterprises. And I even wrote about the Miami International Airport like that. And I don't know, Billy, if they still do this, but people who originally, when they were doing the upgrades and all that, the people who were getting the stores and the franchise, they were always related to somebody in government. And the level of corruption at that airport was unbelievable. It really still has a reputation this day. It's not being the cleanest operation in the world.
And some of the richest movers and shakers to this day are the people that got those contracts, from Alex Pinellas and some of the crooked county commissioners at that time.
And it might be the worst airport in the United States. Certainly in a big city. I would go to the Daytona Beach airport before I seriously try to avoid it, because I know it's, in a way, as a writer, there's going to be an experience you can absorb always at Miami International Airport. There'll be something memorable is going to happen. But when you're traveling on business, you want it to be an uneventful. You don't want to have a spectacle. You don't want to have a fight. You don't want to see your luggage going to another continent. You just want, or have it opened when you get there. It's amazing to me that in a cosmopolitan, sophisticated place that they can't get their shit together. Condé Nast, when they rate the worst airports, and we're there.
To Carl's point, I think of Alex Dowd, remember the mayor of Miami Beach, who was busted with Abel Holtz, a developer who was giving him bags of, as Carl said, very unsophisticated. You're just talking about bags of cash. And this was some petty stuff in those, like thousands of dollars. We were talking about, the running gag is Abel Holtz Boulevard, which is a road in downtown Miami. Abel Holtz Boulevard ends at the federal courthouse, where he was convicted of corrupting this mayor in Miami Beach. But then you fast forward to the 90s. You look at your columns about Miller Dawkins and Odio and Humberto Hernandez. You're talking about millions of dollars they were shaking people down for. And now, 20 years on, you're getting into the tens of millions and potentially billions of dollars. You consider the Miami, Magic City Gentrification District, which is what we call it. It's called the Miami Magic City Innovation District. But you're talking about a $37 million slush fund was negotiated behind closed doors with a city commissioner. But the state attorney isn't looking into this. No one's investigating this. It appears as though they've somehow legalized corruption in some way. But also, Carl, the state attorney, Catherine Fernandez Rundle, she is the only state attorney that we have had since Janet Reno left for the Clinton administration. May she rest in peace. And she's still here, much like the Carollo point. She's still here. Is it not incumbent upon the top cop in a community to crack down on some of this corruption? Like, would we be in the state that we were in if we had been properly prosecuting and holding people, the right people, or the wrong people, I should say, accountable for all of this corruption for decades?
You have to wonder, and this isn't to say someone is honest or dishonest, it's just how much enthusiasm. Corruption cases are tough to build. And in a lot of jurisdictions, local state attorneys and prosecutors wait for the FBI to show up with that they're building a federal case. And then they stand behind them and look good. But, initiating that on a local level, the state attorney's offices, you have to have experienced corruption investigators. You have to know what you're doing. And certainly her track record on corruption cases is pitiful. It's different. It's one of those things, you blame that for the corruption, or do you just say it's a passive way of letting it exist and waiting for it to get so bad that the feds come in and start rounding people up. And then you can say, we've been cooperating with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Right. That's the line. We've been cooperating
the whole time
so much with them. And the truth is, usually they will not be sharing a lot of information with the prosecutor who has not shown much interest in prosecuting.
And rightfully so. And you'd think this would be fertile ground for those kinds of investigations and prosecutions, even locally. But whether intentional or not, it has sent a message of impunity. And it has allowed the same characters to perpetuate their corruption in this community.
That's the sad thing. I don't see an end to that. I know maybe you guys have got a better feel for that, but I think that the reputation that South Florida has for sustaining, enabling, looking the other way, whatever you want to call it, it's not discouraging anybody from coming. You remember, when I was a kid, and I mean a kid in the 50s and things, it was the mob. It was the mafia that came down here. Meyer Lansky moved down here and later, and they felt safe. There was a reason they felt safe. They weren't getting prosecuted. I mean, we got to remember, I don't know how long it took J. Edgar Hoover. It was, I guess, until Joe Palazzi testified that J. Edgar Hoover denied the existence of organized crime. He refused to even use the word mafia, said there's no such thing. We have it all under control. And then all of a sudden it became a priority because he was exposed for completely lying about that. And this was where all the mafia guys would come in the wintertime. All the big ones came down. I mean, not just Capone, but the later generation. It's just no accident that South Florida has always attracted that outlaw element, because obviously they felt safer. And obviously they knew they were going to be among their own. The guy in the cabana next door was just probably from one of the other families in New York.
I have a question. Is that to cast any aspersions on people coming down now? Because as you said, they know the reputation of the community. They know it's a city for sale or a county for sale. They know there's certain things that the permissiveness here for certain things. And is there a concern that maybe people who move to this area or move to this state, famous saying, sunny place for shady people, that we continue to have that reputation? I mean, is it any wonder that we're going to be a hub for cryptocurrency, which is known the world over as the most efficient way to launder
right.
Money? I mean, that can't be a coincidence. And I'm not just picking on the crypto bros. I'm just saying.
No. None of that is surprising. I think you have a lot of migration to Florida right now because of the tax laws and what happened to the residents of New York and California and places like that, where they can't deduct the state taxes. So it's a huge shelter. I mean, it's why half the staff of Fox News it's why Sean Hannity bought his mansion down here. It's why that crowd, not just to be near Donald Trump, but the tax benefits of changing your residency. That's going on. But I also think that, it was the classic Florida story. You guys remember this, that when the pandemic money started being handed out to small businesses, they were getting the initial push of pandemic money. And that knucklehead in South Florida takes his pandemic money and goes out and buys a Lambo, like a bright green Lambo, like nobody's going to notice. And of course, is one of the first ones arrested.
Well, but Brazen is amazing down here. I just, as a historian, and we'll get to your book in a second, Squeeze Me is the name of it, and you should check out all of Carl's work, whether it's the collected works or the fiction. But the best Billy Corben is an indignant, outraged Billy Corben, and the best Carl Hiaasen is a righteously outraged Carl Hiaasen. What are the things that appall you right now as you see what's happening in South Florida as someone who cares about South Florida?
Well, I mean, statewide, I'm appalled by the complete absence of leadership on the vaccine issue, having known several people who passed away early on, and the duplicity and the callousness of it. And also, more than anything, the manipulation of information so that local authorities have to go to places like Johns Hopkins or write to the CDC to get information about what's happening in the county next door, because we have a Department of Health that is basically a state-run information bureau for the governor's reelection campaign. That stuff pisses me off. And the way South Florida was treated by DeSantis in all of this, the punitive measures that were taken against school administrators, they're just trying to keep kids from getting sick and dying, is pretty horrendous. Can I give an example about the corruption? In this case, it's not technically corrupt. The Ocean Reef Club had no problem getting vaccines when folks in Homestead and Florida City couldn't. That's not a coincidence. It's just Tallahassee saying, well, we'll send some down to these poor wealthy Republicans in Ocean Reef. It's no accident that the villages got all the vaccines they needed, while a lot of people weren't. That's the kind of corruption that actually results in people getting sick and dying. It's not just stealing from somebody's pocket. It's not making off with tax money. It's actually taking actions that hurt certain communities in lethal ways. And to me, that is beyond just stealing and just cynicism. That's making a choice about who lives and who dies. That's pretty appalling.
Yeah, of course it is. If we were to have you just do word association with corrupt and fraudulent names in the history of South Florida, covering 5 decades, with the expertise that we have in the room right now of Billy Corbin and Carl Hiaasen, like, what are the names that are coming immediately to mind, and how many of them are still working right now stealing from us in South Florida? Like, if you're just doing names that Carl Hiaasen associates with corrupt, you want to have at it? Can you make it just 5? And you can choose industry if you like, because like I said, you wrote a lot about Big Sugar.
They're still at it. They're now spiritually friendly with the Everglades, apparently, so they say. But they had to get shamed into it. They had to have lawsuits. They had to. And what got their attention was the bad publicity, not the bad water that they were sending downstream. And even now, they're fighting certain basic things. I don't know. The list is so long, and my memory is probably not what it should be, Billy. But I think in terms of just lowlifes, and I referred to this guy, I think, in a column as a pernicious little ferret. And I think I went easy on him in that column. But Humberto Hernandez, who was not only corrupt in government, but when the Value Jet plane crashed in the Everglades, his law firm sent someone out there pretending to be a relative on a bus with the relatives on that levee, handing out business cards for that law firm.
Yeah, it was ambulance chasing the survivors.
Yeah, does it get any worse than that? And in terms of like human life forms, where is that on the scale? Some kind of subterranean shit, you know? Those are stories that stuck with me because, again, the cold-bloodedness of it in the face of this enormous tragedy. And then you look back and go, why was I really surprised by that? How can you be surprised? Look how everything else works. You remember Joe Gersten?
I remember Joe Gersten Uncle Joe. I remember him very well.
Uncle Joe, and he vanished. There was rumors. Where did he supposed to move?
He is in Australia. I believe he's in.
He got in Melbourne. Asylum somehow in Australia. He ran from the authorities, and he was having an affair or something. Who was the Rosario Kennedy? Remember?
That's right. Your memory's pretty good, Carl.
Yeah, and an unlikely pair. Because if you saw Joe Gersten, you didn't often mistake him for Chris Helmsley he was a.
I think you've said it. You don't need to say it. You've said it. Like, that's it. You don't need to go any deeper. Yeah, we understand.
First of all, your skin would crawl imagining, but he was involved. And there was a crack. What was it, Bill? There was a crack. He was at a hotel on Biscayne and was smoking crack.
They found his Mercedes-Benz. He wasn't there, but they found his Mercedes-Benz at like a crack house, allegedly, off of Biscayne Boulevard. And after, I believe, the police discovered it there, he then reported it stolen. I think after that he didn't lend it to this woman and to this guy, but that so there was all sorts of questions about that. And we never.
What was he doing there? And then his reconstruction of how it got there, it was so far from where he lived. Nothing held up about the stories. And there was the other things that were going on in terms of his county commission behavior. And he took off. He just said, screw it, I'm going to. And we all thought, well, Australia is much too civil. They'll never let him stay there. Why would they want him? And he got a barrister certificate there. So he's actually practicing law. So
yeah, complete with the white wig and everything.
Oh
I believe there's a picture of him online somewhere. Yes, currently.
In a white wig?
Yes, currently practicing law.
Are you sure that was in a courtroom? It could have been at a bar.
It could have been anywhere. Yes, you're right. You are so right. That photograph could have been in any number of seedy places, and the courtroom might have been pretty high on the list of seedy, but not the highest. And today, Carl, like if I ask you the thing that worries you most for South Florida right now, as someone who cares about South Florida, now that we're getting, it seems like, to the other side of the pandemic.
The thing that worries me most, and it's something we've been covering a long time and we joke about Manny Yip and the rest of it. But the thing I worry about most is the ability of Floridians to be allowed to vote. The disenfranchise of communities, the laws being passed after what we supposedly had was the most cleanest election, more and more, and making it harder and harder for people who don't have the means and who have limited time to vote. You think in a democracy, the idea is to make sure everybody who's qualified to vote can vote, not make hurdles for people who are old or poor or in nursing or places where they might not be able to get to the poll and they have to hand it to someone to deliver their ballot, or they're standing in a hot line and you're not allowed to bring them water. It's against the law to bring them a water bottle unless you're on the staff. I mean, that is just some punitive right-wing racist shit is all it is. It's just racist legislation. I worry because that's the new face of the Republican Party. We thought George Corley Wallace was bad. When I was a kid, George Wallace was, and he ended up getting 5 million votes that year. We thought that was the face of the Deep South kind of racism, that we had all grown up with and feared or hoped would be gone. But he would have fit right in.
You're worried about the future of democracy, right? Last time that you and I talked, right? And you carry the weight of your brother grieving, your brother shot in a newsroom tragedy because journalism is under siege, and the last president ran on a platform of basically hating Carl Hiaasen and everything he represents.
I think he hates all legitimate media, but of course, then the novel I wrote, I was able to have, now I wouldn't say fun, but just putting that troglodyte on a page, even in a satiric way, that character in the novel got to saying and doing things that the real life president was saying and doing. That's what was so. It is terrifying, and the movement that he inspired is all about hating the press. But that's nothing new. Nixon hated the press. Nixon went after Daniel Ellsberg, the Pentagon Papers. People have this idea that Obama loved the press. Obama did not love the press. He did not love the press conference. He wasn't wild about the press. I don't know of any president modern day that would really dug it. Reagan liked a microphone and an audience. That's not the same thing as appreciating the media.
But one has to wonder, what does Nixon look like? What does Jim Jones look like with social media? Meaning if they existed in a time of Twitter and a time of Facebook, and a time when you used to have to publish misinformation and sort of fringe newspapers or fringe radio stations in the distant AM dial, but now you can have that literally pumped right into your hand, your pocket, your brain, right onto your Facebook wall, which is the first thing you see when you wake up in the morning. And I think of Jim Jones because, well, first of all, I think that we're dealing with cult-like behavior and people in a cult-like trance. And of course, I'm thinking of our friend Tim Chapman, to bring it back around, who of course was one of the first and only photographers on the ground in Guyana and got some of the most horrifying and tragic images that we still associate today with that mass suicide. So I guess that's really crazy. You say Nixon didn't like the media, but Nixon didn't have Twitter, right? Or Facebook.
That's right. That's really true. And that is the terrifying aspect of all of this. When a few years ago, the Herald came to all of us and said, now you have to have a Twitter account. I said, I don't want a Twitter account. I know this is probably not a good thing, but I don't pay any attention to it. They said, you got to do it. You wanted to do it. So I negotiated, I do 3 posts a week or something. So now I'm retired. I still have the Twitter account. Once in a while, I'll put something on it. And people will say to me, well, did you see what they said about your tweet? And I have to say, no, I just post it and get the off of it. I don't look. It was the same thing like when Squeeze Me came out, because there was a character who had a president who was at Casa Bellicosa in Palm Beach, not Mar-a-Lago. But anyway, so a bunch of people said, are you reading what all these Trump people are saying about you in your Amazon reviews? They're really mad at you. And they asked me in an interview, well, God, wasn't that upset you? And I said, well, I've been pissing people off since I started my career. And anyone who was surprised by that book or the portrayals in that book hasn't been paying attention. Well, didn't you read the reviews? And I said, I don't read this truth. I don't read the reviews. I could spend all day online looking at what people were saying about something I wrote. Dan, you could retire right now and spend the rest of your life on this planet with your young bride. You could do that and never go on microphone, just reading everything that's been written or said about you. Well, that's just insane. But I know people who do it. I don't give a rat's ass if they did. Honestly, if they didn't like the book, I don't care. I mean, if I worried about that, first of all, what kind of a journalist would you be? What kind of a commentator would you be if all you did was, well, on the one side this and on the other side this, and you just never took a stand? And you never called corruption the way you saw it. You never talked about a football. You ignored a guy throws 3 interceptions and, well, I don't have a penny on it. What are we kidding here? What is this world, this spineless world where, the people, we're supposed to get upset when people don't like a book you've read, or you've attacked a political favorite of theirs in a column? I don't give a rat's ass.
Squeeze Me is the name of his newest book. It's good that he's still out here writing because he does so with great color, and it is funny, and it is indignant, and it is smart. Carl, thank you so much for spending this time.
And thanks, Billy. It was great seeing you guys. Keep up the great work, man.
Thanks, man. I would argue to this day, Carl is a nonfiction writer. To this day.
Yeah. I mean, you can't, and I don't think I insulted him at all when I tell him the terrain that he was covering was sometimes funnier factually than it was when he was making it up. It's crazy. It's unbelievable what South Florida does. Thank you, Carl. We appreciate it, sir.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for everything.
Stugatz here. Let's take a minute for our friends over at DraftKings. Football fans, who's ready to score some free bets? Now you can when you bet on any NFL game this week with DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. New customers who bet just $1 on either team to score can win $100 in free bets. When a team scores, you score. If Sportsbook isn't available in your state yet, DraftKings won't leave you empty-handed. Everyone can play for huge cash prizes all season long with DraftKings Daily Fantasy Sports Contest. DraftKings is giving all new customers a free shot at millions of dollars in total prizes with their first deposit. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now. Use promo code Dan. Bet $1 on either team to score and win $100 in free bets. If they score, you score with promo code Dan this week at DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. Must be 21 or older. New Jersey, Indiana, or Pennsylvania only. New customers only. Minimum $5 deposit, $1 wager required. One per customer. Restrictions apply. See DraftKings.com/sportsbook for details. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
Billy, before we get out of here for the week, I did want to get your thoughts on what happened with the elections, because we made a lot of noise here locally, and some of the things, like some heartbreaking things, ended up happening in these elections. I don't know if you're numb to it, because you did come in saying, look, we're going to talk about this a lot, but we're not going to change anything. These are foregone conclusions.
Yeah, and some of that I don't want to call it negativity. I'll call it some of that honesty you and I talked about more off air. I'm like, listen, you want to let people know that there is the opportunity to change things by voting. But the reality is that Francis Suarez was going to win re-election. It was just a question of how phenomenal that margin would be. I assumed that Joe Carollo would win on the first ballot. I recommended the best way to vote for a candidate that might force him into a runoff. Same thing with Dan Gelber. I said, all of these are a foregone conclusion. They're a foregone conclusion, A, because of the odd year, elections, which we talk about, a foregone conclusion because they raise outrageous amounts of money from developers and special interests. Second, once you're elected, it's almost assumed that you're going to serve out the term limits, meaning you're going to continue to get reelected. It's because a lot of qualified people don't even bother to run. And lastly, turnout. We talked about it. Turnout was barely going to reach double digits. And I think in the city of Miami, in a city of 460 some odd thousand people, 26,000 people voted in the mayor's race citywide. So you're talking about a tiny fraction. And we talked about that too, that like a tiny fraction of the community, not a plurality, not a majority, are going to elect these next leaders for the next 4 years, or re-elect, I should say, these leaders for the next 4 years. And that's exactly what happens. I'm not here picking horses in a race. All right. I'm here just trying to encourage people to vote better, trying to encourage maybe better people to enter the races. So again, Florida, Miami rarely shocks me, but regularly disappoints me. And I wasn't even disappointed in that I knew what the outcome was going to be. That doesn't make it any less sad, I suppose.
But not surprising. Not your expectations were in the toilet already. So
exactly. Yeah, you can't. It's hard to be disappointed when we've lowered the bar as far as we have.
We will talk to you again next week, sir.
Go Canes.